Hello, herpetologist. So I said I was going to record this last lecture, or the last part of the lecture for us. So here we go. So we were just about to dive into the crocodilians as a group. So crocodilians are intriguing in that they have a bony secondary palate. And as you can see here, it's indicating how, by virtue of having this secondary palate, you're able to breathe while eating at the same time, because now there's a separation of your respiratory path from your esophageal path. So you can see here the air enters in the nose here, goes through your sinus cavities, and then goes down and into the lungs here. And so normally you would have a membrane or some sort of flap of skin that would cover up this hole to prevent you from having food go up into your sinus passageways. So this was a major evolutionary feature and innovation for crocodilians and birds relative to other reptilian species. So other major features that crocodilians have, aside from the bony secondary palate, is they have thecodont teeth. So unlike what we saw with the squamatins, these guys have teeth that are sitting into sockets in their jawbone. And they have pretty uniform teeth, so they're homodont as well as being thecodont. Most people are also aware of the chambers of their heart, and what this diagram is indicating is the variation in the size and shape and number of heart chambers as you look throughout the vertebrate world, or the reptilian world, I guess I should say. So this is the lizard condition, this is the snake condition, so it's primarily a three-chambered heart. Or at least an impartially separated, I guess I should say. Here's the turtle condition, and actually what you're looking at are increasing changes in the division of the septum in the ventricle, but you're also looking at slightly different arrangements of the placement of where that septum is. And as we're focusing on the crocodilians here, we're actually going to talk in more detail about this later because it's usually listed as being completely separated, but there's actually some variations on that theme with the crocodilians. But for now, suffice it to say that they have four chambers. So they have a completely separated ventricle into right and left halves. So, and combined with the two atria, you have four chambers. But the crocodilian heart is capable of doing some really interesting thing in terms of shunting blood, which accommodates it for diving purposes versus when it's not diving. So we'll talk about that more when we talk about the circulatory system and blood shunting. Anyway, four-chambered heart. As we've already discussed, relative to birds as well, they have a high degree of parental care. They build these elaborate nests out of rotting vegetative material, and they put the eggs on the inside of that to incubate. They stay with the females stay with the young for a number of years, and will actually transport them around in their mouths or on their bodies or nearby, and they'll protect them from any sort of predators. And they can vocalize as well. So I'm putting those first three characteristics up here just to remind you of what they are. I'm showing a picture of the skull to also make the point that crocodilian species are pretty large and have incredibly robust skeletons. They have surprisingly small brain cases. So given how large their skull is, and their skull is nearly impenetrable, it's an incredible fortress of bone, but they literally have kind of a walnut or peanut-sized brain case. They have very small brains. We'll talk about locomotion more later. They are clearly, they have lungs. They clearly must breathe air. They're not able to respire in water. However, they can locomote incredibly efficiently in water and go quite rapidly. And they can actually go and when needed, they could go faster in water than they can on land. They do walk just fine on land, although it's kind of a lumbering gait. But more importantly is they're restricted by their physiology. So they can go in fast bursts of energy, but they won't travel very far on land. So you've got a pretty good chance of outrunning a crocodile if it were to give you chase. When they locomote, they do this sort of style. So they place their arms and limbs alongside their body, and then they undulate their body much like a fish to swim. Now, there are three families of crocodilians that are recognized to date: the Gavialidae, the Crocodilidae, and the Alligatoridae. And they are subdivided, as you see, in this tree. I'm not going to hold you responsible for knowing all of the genera of crocodilians, but you should know these three groups and know that generally speaking, these are the alligators, these are the crocodiles, and then these are the gavials or gharials. And we'll talk about each family independently now. So the Alligatoridae, or Alligatoridae, as some people say, includes the alligator mississippiensis, which of course is native to the United States, and then three other genera which are found primarily in Central and South America, but there's also a relict population in China, Alligator sinensis. All Alligatoridae species are freshwater species. They usually do not venture into salt water. They can handle brackish water, but generally speaking, they're freshwater. They have a tendency to be fairly broad-snouted, as you can see here, as opposed to the alligator or the Crocodilidae, which are very narrow-snouted. Never minding the gavials. When you look at their teeth, generally speaking, one external characteristic that most people can point to is that while you can see teeth on the outsides of their jaws, you cannot see a prominent fourth tooth on the mandible that actually pokes up. In crocodilian, so normally their teeth look like this or something along these lines, but in the case of the alligator or the crocodiles, you can see a really prominent lower tooth that's pointing up, and it usually fits into this groove in the mouth that you can see on the outside. So you can see one prominent tooth going up in the crocodilians. You cannot see this in any of the Alligatoridae species. These guys have a tendency to be generalist in terms of their food preferences. They'll pretty much eat anything they can get in their mouths, and it can span the gamut from fish to any kind of terrestrial animals they can get, birds, mammals, whatever they can get in is what they'll eat. In the Crocodilidae, so these are generally saltwater species, not freshwater. They have much narrower snouts than alligators have. They can be very aggressive, particularly some of the species that are in Southeast Asia and Australia. There are a few genera to note. So Crocodilus has the most species, and then Osteolaemus and Mecistops. They, again, have this prominent fourth tooth that you can see erupting from their lower jaw, and you can see it outside their snouts. It's usually fairly prominently located, and actually here you can see more than just the fourth. There's clearly a graduation between the Crocodilus species versus Mecistops. It has a much narrower snout, and actually this snout looks very much like what you get in the gavials. They are also fairly broad in their feeding habits. Again, primarily eating whatever they can get in their mouths. It doesn't matter what it is. The Crocodilidae are famous for their twisting ability. So they often will grab a prey item, and in order to bring it down, if they can, they'll drag it into the water, and then they'll twist and twist and twist until they twist, part of it off. This is often true in the Alligatoridae as well, but because they're not usually as aggressive, you don't often, hear people talk about this, but they'll do that pulling and twisting motion as well and spin around. And then you have the gavials. So they're in the literature, you'll see either the term gharial or gavial, and gharial is just a miscommunication. So when the original species were described, there was and this was of course a long time ago when everything was on pen and paper and not electronic, and so there was a misunderstanding about the spelling, and someone erroneously thought there should be an H after the G and then a V instead of an R, or an R instead of a V rather. So gharials is what came out for the longest time as being their common name, but they're meant to be gavials. And there's two genera, so Gavialis and Tomastoma. And these guys have very narrow snouts with a large assortment of very sharp teeth. And they primarily consume fish. And they're usually grasping these in the water. And as a result, this narrow snout makes it much easier to try and grab those fish when they're in the water. They will eat other things when they come out of the water. It's just that they're primarily adapted for consuming fish. And it's probably also important to note that these guys are also freshwater species, not saltwater. And in addition, I should probably go back and make a point of noting when we look at the phylogeny, notice it's the Gavialidae is sister to the Crocodilidae. So the gavials and the crocodiles are sister taxa, and then both together are sister to the Alligatoridae. Okay. And here's a comparison. Now this is a general sort of diagram, but it shows you the differences in the snout width and attenuation between the gharials, the alligators, and the crocodiles, bearing in mind that there's a little bit of variation within those families. Okay, and then let's go on to the turtles. So we've already covered some aspects of them, and you know this already from what we've covered in class or from 218. But turtles are, of course, famous because of the presence of a shell, which could could be complete or incomplete from the standpoint of can they close up that shell or not. You can see here in this image that their carapace, which is the top shell, the dorsal aspect, and the plastron is what's underneath. The carapace is composed of bone on the inside, and it's fused vertebrae and ribs together with a whole lot of extra endochondral bone. So they really are sort of a fortress, and they're like little tanks. What you can also see prominently in this particular figure is the presence of the pectoral and pelvic girdles inside what would be the rib cage. Now the ribs are fused, but they're located on the inside of their rib cage, which is unlike any other animal, any other vertebrate. It affords them an enormous amount of protection, not only to their girdles but to all their internal organs. The shell being combined for that protection. It's very effective. They have very robust skeletons. And one thing that I'll point out here in just a moment is the neck. So notice the neck here. So you may not realize this, but not all turtles can actually withdraw their necks into their shells. And of course, there's quite a bit of variation in the extent of the plastron shell as well. So let's take a look at some of those features. Oh yes, you should probably note that turtles do not have teeth. They do have a beak, a keratinized beak, but they lack teeth. We already talked about these features being fused, and the plastron and the girdles. Yep, covered all that. Oh, they have pretty intense skulls, very rigid skulls, and that's largely because as young, they can be predated upon by quite a number of predators. And the one part of them that is often not protected by their shell is their skull and their heads. So as a consequence, they've evolved a very rigid skull over time. So we talked a little bit about the shell earlier, but just to go into a little bit more detail, this image from your book is showing you the bone structure on the left and then the scute structure on the right. And there's a couple of points to note. One is some general terminology. So when you're talking about the bones and the scutes in the center, those are referred to as nuchal or neural bones or scutes. Just adjacent to those are the pleural bones. Alternatively, the scutes are usually the costal scutes. And then the outer bones are your peripheral bones, and the scutes that overlie them are the marginal scutes. Now, notice that the scutes are not exactly on top of the bones themselves. So there's quite a bit of overlapping that's happening. So for instance, you can see the pleural bones here are fairly narrow, but the scutes are a little bit wider. So by virtue of being overlapping in that way, that affords them some added durability to the external structures of their bodies. If you're looking at a particular species here, the spotted turtle, So you can nicely see the scutes overlying the bone on the dorsal aspect, on the carapace, and when you flip it over, you can see the plastron. And what's interesting about spotted turtles is they have the ability to largely withdraw into their shell, but not completely. So if you look carefully, you can see the hind limbs sticking out and the tail and the forelimbs are sticking out, and probably the head's tucked in, but not all the way closed. So these guys do not have a hinged shell, or at least not a rigidly hinged. There's a slight hinge. Many turtles have no hinge at all on their plastron. But of course, box turtles and other species, but box turtles in particular, are famous for having these hinged shells that allow them to completely withdraw themselves into their shells and completely close up. So that's a great defensive mechanism for preventing a large amount of predation, because those shells are so rigid, it's pretty hard to crunch through them with teeth or beaks or any other kinds of structures. But not all turtles can do that. So if you flip over, say, a snapping turtle, you can see that their plastron is quite reduced, and it would be very easy to attack their skin, which is pretty fleshy right here, and do them some major damage. Now, as it happens, species that have strongly reduced plastrons are usually very aggressive, very territorial, and they have alternative defenses for keeping predators at bay. And so they often don't have a whole lot of predators. Now, when they're in the water, they're usually pretty calm, but you get them out of water and they're pretty upset by it. There are also some turtles that we've already talked about that have pretty fleshy outer covering. So instead of having just scutes, they have a leathery skin. So the soft-shell turtles are clear examples of this. They too cannot close up their shells or withdraw their bodies completely within their shells. And this is to show you what they look like when you flip them over. So they have a fairly extensive plastron, but it's not completely covering them. So it's somewhere in between the condition that you see with snappers and the condition that you see with other turtles. So there's a fair bit of diversity within the Testudini. So you have things like terrestrial tortoises. So these are usually exemplified by having highly domed shells. They have, if you look at their hind limbs, they have elephantine elephantine feet. So if you look at the feet, they literally look like an elephant's foot in the back, and they're usually pretty flat on the base. This happens to be pushing off because he's walking. And then their front limbs are often very paddle-like with a whole lot of really intense, highly keratinized osteoderms in their skin. And that's because they're usually using the hind limb, the forelimbs for digging. These are also species that are often found in mesic or xeric habitats. And then you have a number of different sea turtle types that have modified front limbs that have been modified into flippers, and their hind limbs have been modified into flippers as well. They have incredibly streamlined, or if you will, torpedo-shaped shells that make them very efficient in water, so they're very ergonomic. They're built basically for swimming and for speeding through the water, although they don't usually go that fast. It's unlike those turtles that you see on Finding Dory. They're not whooshing through the current like that in reality. Then you have a number of sort of pond or riverine turtles. Of course, the sea turtles are saltwater. These riverine turtles are freshwater. They too have a sort of streamlined shell shape, although it's not quite as streamlined as what you get with the sea turtles. They cannot withdraw their heads into their shells usually, or at least not very far. Then you have things like the snapping turtles and relatives. So these are very aggressive species that also have a streamlined carapace, but they have a highly reduced plastron. And just to reiterate, only a little bit. We'll cover reproduction more later, but just so you know, turtles have a true penis structure, a true phallic structure, unlike what we saw with the snakes and the lizards. Crocodilians, by the way, too, also have a true penis structure. And it's completely withdrawn into their tails. similar, sort of similar to what you see with the hemipedes, but it's not a hemipenis, it's a true penis. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm referring to withdrawing the head into the shell. So this is the condition that we see most of the time with all species in the U.S. So they're able to actually draw that neck into their shells, and they do that by pulling in those neck vertebrae, and it forms kind of a U on the inside of their body. And many of them will actually tuck their arms up under their shell to serve as added protection. And when they do, these guys are incredibly strong. So you're going to have a really hard time trying to pull those limbs out from under their shells. And good luck getting their heads out. It's a real challenge. But there's a whole nother group of turtles. Now, we don't see these in the U.S., but if you look in South America and in the Asian regions, these are side neck turtles. So they're incapable of actually withdrawing their neck into their bodies. So what they do is they pull their neck over to the side and actually, kind of tuck it up underneath the shell. Hold on, let me turn this phone off. So they actually tuck it underneath their shell, and then they pull their arms and legs back underneath the shells as well, and they kind of hide up under that shell. So they're not able to close the shell up. So with respect to that particular characteristic, the turtles currently are accepted to form two major groups, the Cryptodira and the Pleurodira. So the Pleurodirans, these are all side neck turtles that you see here, and there's 3 families that are currently recognized. And then the Cryptodiras are all turtles that can withdraw their neck into their shells. Now they can't all close them up. They don't all have hinged plastrons, but they can at least pull the neck back. So this is a major separation that I'd like you to recognize and commit to memory. And so here's the example of that side neck turtle here. So this is a Podocnemidae turtle. And then here's the example of the Cryptodira. So it can pull its head into its shell. So with the phylogeny up in the corner, let's go through a couple of examples. So the Podocnemidae are a group that are found in South America. These are called the South American river turtles. They're strongly analogous to our red-eared sliders or cooters or turtles like that are freshwater. They're aquatic. They do come out to bask and to lay eggs. Clearly they have lungs. All turtles have lungs, so they have to come up and breathe. Although it is true that some turtles can actually respire through the epidural lining of their cloacas. So they can respire to some extent, and so they can actually stay down in the water for fairly extended lengths of time, but eventually they've got to come up and breathe air. Anyway, so these guys are freshwater river species. They're actually highly sought after in South America as a food source. And so as a result, they're under quite a bit of threat conservationally. And so there's quite a bit of effort going into trying to head start these guys and to educate local people about not extirpating this species. There's actually several different species. This is a Podocnemus expansa. Okay, so that's an example of a side neck turtle. That's the only example that I'm concerned with you knowing. If we moved up into the Cryptodirans, I want you to note that there's 2 major groupings here, the Keratochelidae and the Trionychidae. So these are both aquatic turtles. The Keratocheles are a group of sea turtles, so marine. The Trionychidae are, as you can see, found globally, but these are freshwater turtles. So the Trionychidae is the family that the softshell turtles are in. They all have these leathery shells. Actually, both of them, these are the leatherback turtles. They have soft shells, leathery shells. They have pointed noses. They usually will dig down into the sand and hide with their heads out to try and capture fish to consume. They have pretty webbed feet with nails on both the hind and forelimbs for defense. And they are huge biters. You want to be very careful about getting any limbs nearby them. And here's an example of them being buried in the water. So as you work your way up into the Cryptodiria, another example I'd like you to know is the Amididae. So the Amididae is a family that's going to include pond turtles and box turtles. So frankly, a lot of the species that you're going to see in Michigan are in this family. So they include things like the Blandings turtle, spotted turtle, box turtles, you name it, they're in there. Very cute. So these guys have a tendency to be highly domed shells or pretty domed shells. They're terrestrial species, although they can swim and they'll move around in water too. It does include some of the aquatic turtles as well. Right now, it's a little bit of a garbage can group. There are a number of people that have been trying to sort out the relationships within the Amididae, but molecular data has actually been pretty challenging when applied to this particular question. So it appears that turtles in general have very slowly evolving genes kind of across the board. So it makes it difficult to use those data to evaluate phylogenetic relationships. The tests to identity include all of your basic tortoises. So box turtles, gopher tortoises, and related Galapagos tortoises, basically anything that you think of as being a terrestrial tortoise, that's them. And you can see from this range map that they're globally distributed in the appropriate environments. This is an example of a gopher tortoise on the bottom. These guys are very good at burrowing in sandy habitats in the coastal plains in the US. And as it happens, gopher tortoises are incredibly important species because there's a number of heterospecifics that will live in the burrows of gopher tortoises. So they're often considered a keystone species, such that if something happens to the gopher tortoise, then all these other species will collapse, so the food web will collapse. And that's actually been seen in certain areas of the coastal plains of the United States where there's been habitat degradation and these guys have been extirpated, and as a result, a number of other species have been locally extirpated as well. And you can see the variation from certain like mole crickets and particular beetles to rodents, gopher frogs, mammals, and then of course indigo snakes and coach whips have a tendency to inhabit their burrows. The Chynosternidae is a really fun turtle family. So they are distributed in the Americas. So this includes the mud and musk turtles. Very cute little guys. They have a pretty highly domed shell. They're kind of oval shaped. You pretty much wouldn't confuse them with any other turtle. They do have hinged shells, and they often have what looks like either a Y or a K in the shell, and we'll go over this in lab. But they have a hinged shell that they can close up at least partially. And actually on their plastron, you can't see it here, but they internally have these musk glands that when disturbed, if you actually tap them, they'll start exuding this musk, and it has a kind of a subtle smell, but it clearly helps them to mark their way and to find each other. And this is primarily the musky ones, not the mud ones. So there's a couple of different genera in this family, but we'll probably just focus on the Chynosternin in lab. Then we have the Chelydridae. So this is the family that includes the snapping turtles, which you find in north, central, and northern part of South America. There's only a few species in this group, and they look pretty much all the same. And then you have the Cheiloniidae and the Dermachelidae. So, I'm sorry, I think I erroneously earlier said the Keratochelidae or leatherbacks. Sorry, it's these guys, it's the Dermachelidae. And then the Cheiloniidae are the green sea turtles. So these guys are globally distributed, but of course in marine environments, so all the way around the world, as you can see in this map. They are fascinating creatures, and green turtles get to be pretty big, but leatherbacks get to be giant. If you ever have a chance to see sea turtles nesting on the beaches, I highly recommend you do it. It's the most amazing thing you will ever see. It takes a very long time. They spend an enormous amount of time coming up on the beach. They're terrible at locomoting on land, but they're clearly adapted for locomoting in the water. But they have a very hard time getting up the beach. They'll eventually find a place to lay their nest. They'll spend an inordinate amount of time digging it with their hind limbs. They'll then lay their eggs and spend a lot of time trying to cover up and bury and disguise their nest before leaving and going back to the sea. Seeing the emergence of the young is also pretty exciting as well when you see hundreds and hundreds of little turtles actually heading towards the water. These guys are under an incredible conservation crunch. Their eggs are often poached. The turtles themselves are frequently poached as well and are consumed. There is a lot of pollution and trash that's been interfering with their life cycles. So as a consequence, these guys are, at least legally, are under protection by international and national laws, but it's a little hard to do when they're out in the oceans and when they're on beaches that may not be patrolled by police or rangers of any kind. So in some areas, they've done a good job explaining to local people the principles of sustainability. And as a result, they might poach some of the eggs, but they won't poach all of the eggs. And they recognize that if they take them all, they won't have a resource later to depend upon. But not every culture or every individual has long-reaching sight. In some cases, they're very short-sighted and all they care about is right now. So these guys will probably be under threat for a very long time. Okay, that's all I wanted to tell you about the turtles and the crocodilians. So watch this video and then we'll actually combine this week's quiz with next week's quiz. And we'll keep going with Chapter 6 next week on Tuesday. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week.